Okay, let's pick up where we left off. I think the question was, does science guarantee more certitude than philosophy or less? Philosophy guarantee more certitude. What did you put? And by the way, the readings that I gave you, the cobblestone was difficult, wasn't it? Don't worry. We'll go through, it'll get easier and easier as you go through. A lot of the difficulty of the vocabulary was probably unfamiliar. As you chip away and look at the definitions of those and become familiar, like I said, making a glossary for yourselves is quite helpful. You'll start to see that, okay, it's getting a bit easier. Those readings, though, could perhaps have given you a new understanding or a new outlook on philosophy. What is philosophy? So feel free to update if you want. You're not committed to the answers that you give. You can go back and adjust those after critically thinking upon these questions. So what did we say? Science guarantees more certitude or less certitude? Than philosophy.
I thought science guarantees more personal certitude because science is easier for people to grasp as far as facts go.
Okay. Anybody else? And notice each question kind of sets up for the next question, doesn't it? So there's an issue that, and I think we left off on this, and it has to do with agreement. So typically, again, your answers are very similar to each time that a class goes over and answers these. The answers are very similar. And so part of this is the idea that science, remember, is committed to more objective facts, more certain, whereas philosophy deals with more subjective or more kind of opinions and personal perspectives. That's typically the answer that one gives. And it might be that, at least as far as a psychological motivation for that would be, well, if you go around and you ask people, what is the best tasting food? Do we get universal agreement? And you would probably argue that because that's subjective, it has to do with personal preferences and taste, which exist in the subject, and are not objective facts like the earth has a sun. But any time that we get a position in our mind or another person presents a position, we should try to question that and see, are there any counterexamples to that? Does that really hold? Does agreement within a community or a group necessarily mean that it's objective fact? Well, we might think so, because if I ask 1 + 1 equals what? 2. Oh, surprise, surprise, everybody gives the same answer. Well, that would make sense because it's an objective fact that's observer independent. Just like the earth has a sun. Is going to be true regardless if my beliefs match up with that or not, or whether there's anybody to believe anything at all. If there's no people around, it's still going to remain a fact. Why? Because that's the very notion of objective truth. It's people, subject, person, observer, independent. So we'd expect that our beliefs would line up with the facts, because objective fact is not simply a matter of vote. And likewise, if we get, for example, with what's the best tasting food, if we get different answers, we might suspect, well, different answers means that there's just different perspectives. There is no absolute objective answer on this. But is that necessarily true? the way to test that is to see if we can find an opposite position of in which we would hold something to be objectively true, but people would give multiple answers. Well, can you conceive, at least in the realm of possibility, that I went around and I gave that question 1 plus 1 equals, and perhaps everybody gives a different answer? Just because people were given a different answer to what we would assume to be obviously objective fact, does that mean that therefore it's subjective and just a matter of opinion? What if I paid you off? What if I said, I'm going to give you, each and every one of you, $5 to give a different answer? That might be a reason why people are giving. Could be you're just being stinkers and ornery. And go watch, we're going to mess with the professor and give her. But the fact of the matter is, there's nothing that necessitates that you have to put number 2 in there. And therefore, just because you're giving different answers doesn't mean that it's not an objective fact. So do you see how we set up a counterexample? Also, what if I put up compute the limit of some derivative? I guarantee you I'm probably not going to get the same answers. And that might be because it's a difficult equation. It could be that perhaps some people are not familiar with calculus or have experienced calculus. But the point still stands that, again, that doesn't mean that just because I'm getting different answers that it's subjective and not objective. In other words, is truth simply a matter of a vote? Do we make what's objectively true because it's democratic, we just all vote on, well, really, is there a sun? I don't know, let's take a vote. Voila, now it's objectively true because we all voted on it? Well, no, because your understanding of objectivity is people, observer, independent. Likewise, in philosophy, we were saying that you're going to get, obviously, in philosophical questions, you're going to get different answers. Does God exist? Is there a soul? Is everything just matter? What is the correct political society? What ethical situations are correct? Which ones are bad? Go to any philosophy department and ask philosophy professors, and you're going to get multiple answers. And again, psychologically speaking, we probably want to say, well, that's because everybody's just approaching it differently. And there really is no objective answer on, is that necessarily true? Just because we're getting different answers? No, it's not necessarily. Now, we don't know if philosophy is objective or not, but what we're doing is just saying that just because we're getting different answers, in other words, philosophy doesn't look like it requires agreement within this philosophical community as a whole. Or is there agreement? Does God exist? Is the world simply material? What's the correct? No, it doesn't. You go around and it doesn't seem like. Now, what about science? If we went and asked any science professor, how many elements are there? Would they say 4? No, it's how many elements in the periodic chart?
118.
118. So they're not going to say, well, it's just a matter of opinion, right? For you, it might be 10, but for me, it's 118. No, there seems to be agreement and science within the whole. I mean, established science. Obviously, there's always theory that can be debated. Now, there might be a reason for that. And it leads to the next question, well, does science bring about progress? What would you say? What did somebody say? That's a strange word, progress. Is it what is progress? A movement? Notice I didn't say digress. That's still a movement too, right? to digress, to progress.
Well, like an improvement in society.
Something that develops over time.
Yeah, I always have this picture of kind of like an upward, like it's going up, it's getting more, getting better, progressing. Well, it's going is it going somewhere? Where are we going on this ride? This science ride. So the idea is we're getting more what?
Closer to the truth.
Closer to the truth. Now, how would philosophy progress? Again, for science to progress, it seems that there needs to be universal agreement. Unlike philosophy. Philosophy might not require, universal agreement. So the type of progress in philosophy might look very different than the type of progress in science. Obviously, how is science going to progress? We talked about science is concerned, remember we made a distinction between different types of knowledge. Theoretical knowledge versus practical knowledge. And one of the things that you pointed out was that science brings about technology, which comes from the Greek word techne. And techne has to do with the art, or the tools of the artisan, concerned with producing, making, and doing. So it's an applied knowledge, typically within science, that you acquire knowledge for the sake of producing and making. Now, how well are we going, if science is concerned with it, then its progress is concerned with techne, with praxis, a knowledge, applied knowledge. Applied knowledge for the sake of producing, making, and doing. That's why you always saw those billboards back in the day. Science is power, and it had like an astronaut going. Because science we can go into space and do these various things. Now, in order to make, produce, and do something is a community. I'm sure that requires agreement. How are we going to make something if we can't decide what unit, what type of measurement we're going to use, or how many elements there are? So therefore, at some point, the scientific community can't be like the philosophical community where they're debating these various issues. Because as long as you're debating, how are you ever going to get to work and use that knowledge, universally speaking, among? No, because everybody's going to have a different position on it. So it seems in order for science to progress, there has to be, for the most part, agreement within the scientific community as a whole. However, philosophy is a bit different. And in many senses, philosophy is an individual exercise. Why? Because in order for you to think about philosophical questions, you don't have to go look up years and years of collected data or agreed measurements. Anybody can sit in their armchair and think about, well, what does it mean to be a decent, good human being? Is the world material, or are there immaterial aspects of it? How can I think more critically? These questions, do you have to get a textbook? Now, it could help if you take up a textbook and you read some great authors who have thought about this a lot longer and much deeper than ourselves, but it's not necessary. On the other hand, science, can you do astronomy without previous collected data and measurements? Not very well. You could look, but you couldn't really. It requires agreement within the scientific community as a whole, because it's more of a communal exercise and trying to achieve knowledge. Whereas philosophy can be a very individualistic exercise in pursuing knowledge. Yes, sir?
So those last three words in the bottom, rendering or applied knowledge, what was those?
Producing, making, and doing. Okay, here's something to think about. Because remember, this is what we call a thesis, and then you present the antithesis, the antithesis. And then you can object to that. And as you go back and forth and test each thesis against its contrary, you hopefully get more narrowed into what actually is the truth of the matter. So let's try this. Well, science does require, and because you said it's concerned with achieving objective knowledge, whereas philosophy might be concerned more with subjective, individual perspectives, that's why, obviously, we see agreement as a whole, and also because it's concerned with making and doing applied knowledge. Now, is that because objective facts don't change? I mean, is that going to be 3 tomorrow? Remember 4 the next day? 10 the next day? No, we have the idea that objective truth is absolute. Universal. What do we mean by universal? That's not just true for you, it's true for me and everybody, in fact, the entire universe. So it's universal. It's not something particular like the taste of pad thai. Absolute, universal, and mutable. Facts don't change. It's typically the understanding of objective truth. But what about science? If it's concerned, and it's more certain, it's concerned with objective truth, does science change? Does agreement change? Well, look at the history of science. Let's start with (450 BC). Let's look at that historic timeline. Now, I bring up 450 BC because that's exactly when philosophy and science emerge and begin within society, roughly around this period, the 5th century BC. Let's ask a science question and see if within this expanse of time, whether we have universal agreement within the scientific community. Do we live in a geocentric or a heliocentric universe, solar system? What would science say? Has it always said we lived in a heliocentric? This whole time period, it's saying it's geocentric. Then all of a sudden, it changes. Now it's, oh no, we changed our mind. It's heliocentric. Got that one wrong.
What are the differences between those 2 words?
Oh yeah, good one. Geo. Who wants to take a stab at geo? Means Earth.
Earth and universe.
Right, so like if you study Earth science, geology. Helio. Who wants to take a stab at that? Sun. So the idea is, well, what do we live in? Do we live in where the Earth is the center and the planets and the sun are moving around the Earth? Or is it, no, it's helio, the planets, including Earth, are moving around the sun. We don't have universal agreement within science. Right now we do. Zoom in on any period of time there, we do. What about how many elements are there? In science, do we have universal agreement? Have they always been saying, oh, 118? No, for the most part, you have saying 4 elements. Not until Mendeleev that you get that, the periodic chart, and that starts to be filled. And even with the periodic chart, it didn't start with 118. Does that not trouble you? If science is so certain, why is it constantly changing its mind on things? Could say, well, it's because it's getting better, it's making corrections. But let's pause for a second and consider, well, how do I know that this isn't going to change and we're going to find out something else? Fact, there's a principle within science. Take anything that's considered scientific fact, and in 200 years, it's not going to be scientific fact. It's going to be overthrown and something else. For me personally, that shakes my confidence in absolute objective certitude, getting facts, because it's changing. Vice versa, if you look at philosophy, yes, at any particular time, if you zoom in and you ask philosophers questions, you're going to get various answers, different perspectives. That doesn't mean, as we saw, that there is no correct answer. It could be, like we said, it could be difficult. Maybe that's just really difficult and it's very hard to get the correct answer, and so everybody's making mistakes in various ways. It could also be because philosophy is concerned a lot with values. Values always has a subjective element to it, or a personal element to it. In other words, there might be particular reasons why you may not want to accept that God exists or does not exist. There might be particular reasons or motivations within your experience of why you might not want to accept a certain ethical or political theory. That complicates things. Whereas this, I don't think anybody's going to say, yeah, but I don't know. I'm going to have to change my lifestyle if I have to say that's number 2. Things are really, I don't know. I've had some bad experiences with number 2. And I just don't know if I'm committed to that. That's the great thing about mathematics, is it's pretty much value neutral. And so it makes, in one sense, it very clear and very easy to obtain the objective truth on that, because I don't have to consider various perspectives and biases and experiences in human values. But when you get into other disciplines that are involved in those sorts of things, oh yeah, it complicates matters. And wouldn't that be a reason? Of course, I'm going to get different answers on the same question. But what's really interesting is that if you look over the entire course of the history of philosophy, the big questions, the big philosophical and ultimate questions, you pretty much have universal agreement. Guess what? Does God exist? Well, most people come in and go, oh, it's interesting that you're a priest and you're doing philosophy. Well, the reason why people say that is because we know today that most people studying philosophy probably don't believe in God, that they're atheists. So it might be shocking. But what's interesting is that's a very modern, recent phenomenon. In fact, prior to the 1800s, philosophers almost unanimously agreed, yes, God exists. And in fact, they were monotheistic. It wasn't just, we believe in the idea of God, but one God. What about questions, do human beings have a soul? Universal agreement. Ethical questions. Is there objective morality? Universal agreement across the board. So it depends how you're approaching these questions. If you look at a particular time period within science, of course, you're going to find universal agreement, and the reason why is science requires that in order to do what it does and to progress. Now, everything has different kind of tools and methods. Science has its own, and therefore it requires, in order to get to work and produce and do things, you have to have at that particular time universal agreement. That's not required in philosophy. However, you look at the large expanse, the entire history of science, it's changing all the time. Whereas philosophy, for the most part, on the big ultimate questions, you tend to find universal agreement. Isn't that interesting? Now, let's go to, this might help us answer some questions, because it's going to get us to number 6, trying to provide a working definition for what is science and what is philosophy. Who remembers what the word etymology means from last class?
Studying the origin of words.
Yes, the origin and meanings of words. So let's do a bit of etymology. Science derives from the Latin word scientia. Does anybody know what the Latin word scientia means? And science means scientia. So we get the word science from scientia. So it's obviously, the meaning of this is obviously to be found. It's going to elucidate the meaning and understanding of this much more once we understand what in Latin scientia means. Where we take a guess? Oh, who said that? Bam! Knowledge. Now remember, in the questionnaire, I designated purposely and qualified science as the hard empirical sciences, positive sciences, chemistry, biology, geology, anatomy. That is kind of the modern notion of science. But it's interesting, that's not the classical notion of science. The classical notion of science, the traditional notion, derives from scientia, which is knowledge. Any discipline dedicated to knowledge. In other words, for the ancients, for the medieval, scholasticism, up till really the Enlightenment, every discipline was a science. Everything was a science. Everything that wanted to get knowledge. Now, you could figure, well, what kind of knowledge? What if I want to know knowledge of chemicals? Well, then, my science that I get is chemistry. What if what I want to know is life? I want to know about life. I want to study life and living things. In other words, word bios. What science would that be? Biology. What is also, what if I want to study numbers and magnitudes? What science would that be? mathematics. What if I wanted to study let's see. Morality. I want to know about morals, morality. What science would that be? Ethics. So there's a science of ethics in the traditional sense. What if I wanted to study, people? I want to know about people. Well, the Greek word for people, anthropos. What science would study anthropos? Anthropology. What if I wanted to study people writ large? Society. Sociology. If I want to study structure, anatomy of the human body, anatomy. What if I want to study and know about beauty? Is there such a thing? The science of beauty? That's interesting. Cosmetology pulls from this study, but there's a more basic. That's a good one.
Art.
Yeah, getting close to art. Starts with an A. Aesthetics. Aesthetics. Now notice that each, well actually, let me put another one up. This is really good. What if I want to study nature? Does anybody have a, before I put the clue up, does anybody have an idea of what science that would be? Should I give the clue? Yeah. The Greek word for nature is physis. P-H-Y-S-I-S. Physics. Isn't that interesting? The science of the study of nature and natural things. Physics. What if I want to study about God? What science would that be? Theology. There's a Greek word. Theos. For God. So ology, the study of God, is theology. And that is considered, in the traditional sense, to be a science. Now notice, in order to create a science, you don't have to first know things. What you need is an attempt to know things. You need a roadmap. So you can create a science, in fact you need to create a science before you begin to even know the things that you're trying to know. So it is possible to create a science without knowing the things yet, because you need that roadmap. Well, what am I going to study when I create a science? Well, I better make sure that I'm not getting these mixed up, that I'm not studying chemicals and think they're God. Or that people are numbers. This is the demarcation issue. Each science must have its demarcations, must be demarked out so that you don't get these things confused. Now sometimes, for example, a science may use the knowledge from another science. We saw that with mathematics. Physics and engineering will use that. For what purpose? To study structure, to apply these things. But when they're doing that, they're not mathematicians. That you could be a mathematician But when you're using and studying the mathematics and numbers for the sake of understanding structures and weights and supports, then you are an engineer. So as a person, you can switch from different, and you can pull from different. For example, in physics, you might want to appeal to ethics. Why? The things that you might do in physics and making things that you might want to consult the science of morality. Should I make this? Should I set it off? Well, physics will tell you how to make a bomb. But physics isn't going to tell you, should I set the bomb off? Well, what science does that belong to? Ethics. Ethics says, don't do it. Danger. People are going to get hurt. And getting hurt is bad. That's ethics. That's important that we're capable of, again, demarcation. That there's these different sciences. Not to be confused, but one science can use the knowledge of another science in helping it. Now notice that each and every one of these is a particular type of knowledge. Again, when you're studying ethics, you aren't studying mathematics and vice versa, because we've marked that out clearly as different sciences, different things to be known. And that's why each and every one of these is a particular science. In other words, it's attempting no particular subjects. Do you think that it's possible to create a science that's universal? In other words, could you have a science that was not restricted to any one particular topic? In other words, it could study all things. Is that possible? Now, that's why qualified. In order to create a science doesn't mean that, for example, when I create the science of mathematics, it doesn't mean that I have to know anything about numbers, and it means I'm attempting to know. So you create your science before you actually know. And obviously, we don't. The science of mathematics doesn't know everything there is to know about numbers, and it fills in. So therefore, is it possible to create a universal science? Of course, knowing that, no, we're not going to know everything, but what we're saying here is there's no topic within that science that would be off limits. You could study anything and everything. Is that possible? And if it is, what would you call it? Oh, man, you got it. That's exactly what philosophy is. So here is your first working definition of philosophy. Now I'll add this caveat here. The science of all things humanly humanly knowable. In other words, by the power of your human reason alone. Now, why might I say that? Because I can anticipate somebody objecting that, yeah, but there might be another way of receiving knowledge apart from human intellectual powers. What might that be? Well, possibly divine revelation. That if there is a God, perhaps God could instill knowledge into a person individually without the person trying to work out through their own faculties the truth of the matter. That might be possible. If that is possible, and it does seem possible, then you might want to add that caveat. Well, that's not what I mean by philosophy. I don't mean just receiving any knowledge of any topic, but obtaining or at least aiming to obtain, knowledge of what's humanly knowable through the power of one's human faculties. That's what philosophy would be. Or you could also put science of correct thinking about all things. This is why we get the phrases, what's your philosophy of life? What's your philosophy of cooking? What does that mean? Well, what do you think about? Or hopefully, what are your correct thoughts about cooking or life? So, philosophy can be, you could even have a philosophy of mathematics, a philosophy of biology. What does that mean? It means thinking about that science. So you're kind of stepping back out of the science and you're not just thinking about numbers, you're thinking about the entire science. How does this work? What makes a good theory? All these things, that would be a philosophy of biology. You're thinking about that in terms of biology or mathematics. So you're starting to see the universal nature of philosophy as a universal science. And by the way, the etymology of philosophy comes from two Greek words, phileo and sophos or sophia. Philia, like Philadelphia. What do you think phileo means? Yes. Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. Love of Sophia. What's Sophia? Wisdom. Now, wisdom is a type of knowledge. But notice, that's what science means, is knowledge. So each and every one of these is a love or a desire for knowledge. But none of these is a desire, a love of wisdom, which means there's a distinction between knowledge and wisdom. What's the difference? Seems to me that wisdom's a type of knowledge, but not every type of knowledge is wisdom. Just like every dog is an animal, but not every animal is a dog. So you would tell me, well, what's the difference? And you'd make a distinction. Well, what's the distinction between wisdom and knowledge? What do you think the difference is? Well, let's just think about, you can imagine, how many people have seen, they're like the 9-year-old kid that's like a savant, and they're already like graduated high school and they're taking college courses, and they know a lot. But there's always something kind of awkward when the 9-year-old kid's in the class. What's awkward about it? They're usually like, well, excuse me, that answer is actually, and there's just kind of this awkwardness. They seem to know a lot about a particular subject matter, but they lack something. Experience. Yeah. So there's something maybe to do with experience. Whereas, if you've seen an old man who seems to know something about everything, it's like, I know how to fix this. It's like, wow. And guess what? Picks up the violin, plays the violin. It's like, wow, he's a musician too. Now, then he goes up on the board and does this amazing math proof, and it's like, okay, this is somebody that doesn't just know something, they seem to be wise. Or how many people know what an idiot savant is? Well, I use the word savant. What does savant mean? Got a prodigy, genius. Obviously, we know what idiot is. So it's funny that we mix these two opposing words together. We have an idiot savant. What is an idiot savant? It's this mixture between, obviously by idiot, not in this necessarily derogatory sense, but they don't know things. So a genius that doesn't know things. Oh, that seems like an oxymoron. How many people are this old movie with Tom Cruise, Rain Man? What's up with Rain Man? Who's this guy? Who's this man? Rain Man.
He's good with numbers.
He's an idiot savant. He's a genius, a savant, when it comes to numbers. How about the rest of his life? Pretty well skilled and, yeah. He has no social knowledge. Can't tie his shoes. Can't do basic. But when it comes to mathematics and counting, remember he has a scene like they drop the toothpicks and he's like, 735. It's like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? You count the toothpicks and it's like, you got it, 735. Or you might have seen similar people and they basically look like they're mentally handicapped, and then all of a sudden they get on the piano and it's just, they're a prodigy. It's like, what in the world? We would say they're very knowledgeable, but they're not wise. So there's obviously we are seeing a difference between being knowledgeable in a particular area versus universally. A person, a Renaissance man or woman, a person that's attempting to know all things, typically, and that comes through oftentimes experience, because experience is part of knowing and seeing how all these various topics integrate and connect to one another. It's here that we start to, when it comes to knowledge, give the title wisdom. A wise person is somebody that doesn't just, they're not an idiot savant. They're not somebody that's, I might be really good at mathematics, but my people skills, my morality is totally off. And I know nothing about art or beauty. Obviously, you wouldn't say, well, that person's very wise. No, they're very knowledgeable in a particular area. And that really is the distinction between particular knowledge and universal knowledge, between wisdom and knowledge as knowledge per se. Therefore, because philosophy is understood as the love of wisdom, it's the desire to not restrict yourself to any one particular subject matter, but to consider and to know all things. So isn't it interesting that people often will say, well, philosophy seems really unpractical. What kind of job are you going to get with that? Well, remember, apart from a technical school, trade school that's going to give you a piece of paper, I don't know of any diplomas or pieces of paper that get you a job. Who or what gets you a job? You do. So now you have to think about, well, what could I study that would best prepare me to achieve what I want? The career, the life, my idea of happiness. Would it be chemistry? What would best equip you? A science that wasn't restricted in any way. A science that can consider all things. And this is why employers are actually hiring more and more philosophy majors. What can you do with philosophy? It's not just becoming a philosophy professor. You can do anything. Because you learn how to think critically and correctly, not about one particular thing, but as you study philosophy about all things. which becomes universally applicable to whatever career, and employers started figuring this out and hiring people. And also, you'll notice it on graduate entrance exams, whether it's the GRE or if some of you want to go to law school, you take the LSAT. What majors score always hands down the highest? Philosophy. Why? Because they're not restricted in what they've studied and mastered. They've studied, philosophy is so wide scope in its range of materials that it studies that you get this universally advantageous knowledge that could be applied. So, contra the naysayers, philosophy probably is the best way to prepare you for whatever you want to go, and therefore the most practical, even though it's concerned with a lot of theory and theories. Now, we're going back to the concern that, yeah, but how does that work? Because it seems subjective, personal. Well, it's really interesting because science ends up depending upon philosophy. Because, well, even think about this, so does mathematics. Mathematics is not going to consider whether numbers exist. It assumes it. What would wonder, do numbers exist, and if so, where? Philosophy. Philosophy and mathematics would consider that. What about how to construct a science? And why should we accept the heliocentric over the geocentric? Philosophy considers those questions. By the way, why did that change? So what I'm doing now is we set up science to be, it's aimed at objectivity, and it has more certitude than philosophy. Now I'm going to tear that all down.
I have a comment.
Yes, please.
I feel like you can always say that with psychology as well. So what's the difference?
Yeah, what is the... Well, psychology is not... And we forgot to put that up there. To study the mind, the Greek word psyche. So that's where we get psychology. But psychology is a particular science. It doesn't consider things beyond the mind. It might use, remember, knowledge from other sciences, but it's not a universal science. So that would be one distinction. Also, what science is going to consider what theory of psychology is better than another? Who's going to do it? Can't be the psychologists. It's the philosophers. So that's why you start to see undergirding all of these sciences is a universal science that thinks universally about, well, why should I accept, why is this why is a Jungian theory better than a Freudian theory or vice versa?
Would you say like the difference is like psychology is studying why we think the way we think rather than how we think? Or
it depends because there's two fields of psychology. So there's behavioral and then there's what? What's that? Cognitive. Yeah. So. And because they're considering the soft science, remember 1 foot kind of in science, one kind of in the theories, that they're going to employ a lot of the methods of the hard empirical sciences of like the how. Well, so behavioral is not necessarily asking why, but rather explaining how. That certain inputs come in and then I see certain outputs. And therefore I can make predictions on theory. That's all very kind of how. But you have theory within psychology. theory typically is a context explaining why all these things work the way that they do. Well, because here listen to my theory. Now, also, part of the success of science and why people tend to think that it's much more objective than it is because of that doing and prediction. For example, if I have a theory about mass and gravity and velocity, you're going to say, well, how do I know your theory is true? How can you prove it? Well, through the experiment. Well, watch my theory. According to my theory, if I give this a certain velocity and directionality, it's going to carve out this exact parabolic arc and then land right at that point. It's like, yeah, I don't believe it. Okay, watch. Bam! You'll probably say, lucky, lucky, lucky. That was just a lucky shot. Now, what happens if I keep repeating it 1,000 different times under various conditions, and it ends up doing exactly what I say? You're going to say, theory confirmed. This is the whole process behind the scientific method. Hypothesis, right? I have a thesis, experiment, verification, confirmation of theory as fact. There's a big problem with that, though. Just because something works doesn't mean that it's true. Guess what? The geocentric universe works perfectly well. In fact, you can predict where all planets and stars are going to be into the future. And in fact, sailors still navigate on the Ptolemaic geocentric model. And as a philosopher of science, Van Orman Quine points out in his theory of undetermination of data, guess what? There are an infinite amount of theories that are all different, that will all fit the data equally. In other words, yes, you can have a theory about projectiles that doesn't work. So if it doesn't work, you can falsify it and say, well, clearly that's not true. It has to account for the data and appearances. So there's probably an infinite amount of theories that don't fit the data that you can mark off. But there's also an infinite amount of theories, because the next person can step in and say, yeah, but my theory is different. And guess what? It works. That's why we have two different models, a helio and geocentric. They both work. They both account for the data, but they're different theories. They're basically saying, one's saying reality looks like this, and the other one says it looks like that. Well, if science is supposed to be objective, I can't have that. They can't both be true at the same time, can they? Can one person say 1 + 1 = 3, and the other one says it's 2, and they're both right? If it's objective? That's puzzling. So why did we change? How come we went from a geocentric to a heliocentric? Did we progress? Did we just get more and more knowledge and information, and we finally just discovered it? I used to think so until I studied the history of science. Who is the first person to come up with the proposal that, yeah, I don't think it's the Earth's the center. I think it's the sun. Copernicus. Right. And then you have people like Tycho Brahe and Galileo, Kepler, who then confirmed and moved this further into being accepted. But it is Copernicus, and it's not because he saw it. Part of the problem is, remember, it's Galileo who comes up with the telescope. And even the telescope's not going to help anyways, because first of all, your appearances, it does not look like we are going around the sun. When you wake up in the morning and go to bed at night, what do you see? The sun moving around you. So your intuition Well, observations are just the opposite. Note that it looks like the sun is moving around us. Now the problem is, you wouldn't know either way unless you could get out of the entire system. Why? Why do I say that? Because assuming we're moving around the sun, what if you got out of the solar system far enough that you actually saw, oh, whoops, this is actually moving around some other point. And once I pull out far enough, I actually see that, relatively speaking, it's the Earth that's the center. So it depends on where your perspective is. And this is exactly what Copernicus does. He doesn't collect evidence and just build a case and go, well, I've just discovered and proven that it's what we call in philosophy of science, as Thomas Kuhn says, a revolution, like a political revolution or a conversion. Out with the old regime and in with the new. So it's what if we have a different fit? What if it looks like this? So although we are perceiving in a heliocentric, from this perspective, such that the sun and the other planets are moving around, what if I could put myself on the sun? Would things look differently to me? Absolutely they would. You'd have a complete different model. And that's exactly what Copernicus does. So he doesn't prove, and science doesn't work this way. It doesn't go from data, facts, and evidence to confirm theory. It's always theory assumed, not proven, because the theory gives the story for how to perceive all the data. And given a different theory, you're going to talk about the evidence and the facts and data in different ways. From this theory, I have the planets moving around, and I have them moving around on epicycles, actually. I move to a new theory, a heliocentric. Now the facts and data are all different. So the theory is the cohesive story, the narrative that makes sense of facts. So it doesn't go facts and evidence confirm theory. Theory is always first. And the way science changes is very much like a revolution. They get tired of an old theory, like an old regime. They want a coup d'etat. Throw out the old and get a new one. And there might be reasons for that. But it's never because it's objective fact and we've just proven and figured it out. So notice that science isn't as secure as we think. Furthermore, if it doesn't depend on, and if philosophy is not aimed at establishing objective fact, it doesn't mean that it does, or that each philosopher gets objective facts all the time. But if philosophy is not oriented by its very nature to obtain objective facts, there can be no objectivity in any science at all. Why? Well, think about this. Let's assume we have an objective fact that I've got this petri dish. And my hypothesis is mitosis. What's mitosis? When I introduce substance X into the cell, I get mitosis. What's mitosis?
Split.
Cell division. I have a hypothesis. Now I'm going to do experiments under various conditions. Now my eyesight's not too good, so I can't tend to see cells on you guys. Are you there? Is that you? I can hear you. Well, I need an instrument to magnify my instruments. So I get a microscope. I look on this, and after 1,000 times of experimenting, I find out, oh, really interesting. When I introduce substance X, I get mitosis, cell division. Now, confirmed. Let's assume that's fact. Can that be objective fact if I don't know some philosophical questions? How about, do I exist? Am I even looking through the microscope? In order to make a statement of mitosis, there has to be a person there, we have to know at least, who made the observations to give the statement, substance X introduced to cell creates cell division, mitosis. Could that be true if nobody observed it to make that factual claim? Well, where does that question lie? What science? Do I exist? How do I know I even exist? Philosophy considers that. And because, as Descartes, as we'll find out, shows that you cannot question your own existence without contradicting yourself. Why? Well, who's asking the question? Is it the table or is it you? I'm asking the question, I want to know if I exist. Well, there must be an I, whatever that is, that has to be asking the question, so you exist. Any time that you're thinking or doubting or questioning about your existence, of course you exist. There's no other way around it. Because if you say I don't, you mean the I that exists, doesn't exist, that's a contradiction. So you're able to establish I exist within philosophy. That is a necessary condition if there's going to be any facts, objective facts in science. What about this? Is there even an outside world to observe? What if this stuff's all in my head? What if it's like the Matrix? Or worse, we're not even like Neo and Pods. Some crazy scientist just has us in brains in a vat and has hello class, disconnected, and it's just a program, an awesome VR experience. It's like, wow, I think you're all here. It's just a computer program. Well, what kind of questions, what kind of discipline and science considers questions? Is there even an outside world, or is it all in your head? Is it all just a matrix? Well, philosophy would answer it. And you better get that straight objectively if you're going to say, I exist, and I'm looking through a microscope at an external world, and I've established this as an objective fact. If those philosophical claims are not objectively known or true, and science depends on that, then what could we say about science? So do you see that the relationship, and this would apply the same to psychology, because psychology is making observations and claims, dictates about the external world and about people and their psychology and their behavior. So if you haven't squared out certain philosophical facts, the whole house of cards comes crumbling down. So you can see why philosophy is so important and why it's necessary and why all the other disciplines depend on it too. That's why it's no coincidence that most of history's scientists and mathematicians were also what? Philosophers. In fact, physics, if you look at Newton's book, it's called natural philosophy. Is the name. That was physics. Thinking correctly about all things within nature. Well, guess what? You do natural philosophy. A question so far on that. So again, what we were able to do is that we started off with some preconceptions about what we thought science and philosophy and their natures were, and we saw that we raised some certain objections. Maybe that's not the case. Objective facts aren't going to change, but science changes all the time. Philosophy seemed that it was more subjective and concerned with opinions. We saw that actually that's probably not the case, because we need objectivity to be established in philosophy if there's going to be any truth, objective truth in anything at all. Why? Because it's a universal science. Because these other sciences assume certain facts, just like mathematics. It assumes that numbers exist. It doesn't try to prove it. Philosophers do that kind of stuff. Psychology does not try to prove that minds exist. How do you know there's a mind? I don't care about that as a psychologist. I'm just assuming it does, and I'm getting it to work. Does that clear up? Any questions about that so far? Yes, sir.
Theories?
Theories.
In general, like as you said, like certain things, the theory can be only like, can be used for whatever, like a planet, for instance, is considered a planet, or that they're trying to still prove a theory.
Yeah.
Or then would it still be under philosophy?
That's a good thing too. And also, so you can have like a general theory. For example, Newtonian physics is a theory. Okay. Why? Because it is the whole narrative of how to perceive all the data and therefore interpret fact. But then you can, as you rightly pointed out, you can have lowercase theories within the theory. For example, you're operating within Newtonian mechanics, and let's say you have a hypothesis about a particular planet that has not been confirmed. Now, all that confirmation and the hypothesis forming and experimentation is going to happen within that theory. I can't go, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to switch over to the old school theory. I'm going to try it. That doesn't work. So, yeah, you're correct to, again, these kinds of theories are done within the science, qua science. Establishing whether I should accept theory 1 versus theory 2, and which one is true or which one is a better one to accept, would lie in the purview of philosophy. So that's why when Copernicus says, I'm not going to try to prove my theory, I'm assuming it so I can make sense of proofs and evidence and facts within my story, my theory. He's doing philosophy when he makes that. Then once everybody accepts the, you know what, we're going with theory 2, guys. Out with the old. Then you can get on with business. And then you can start confirming, making hypotheses within. And it has to be that way in order for science to progress. Imagine if everybody was just debating, yeah, but my theory is, my theory, nobody's going to get anything done. Does that help clarify? Great questions. Yes?
So in philosophy, is there any theories, or is it just have to be theory?
No. So again, because everybody, if you went around to a philosophy department and asked philosophers different questions, you're going to get different answers. Now, just like the mathematics problem, 1 plus 1 equals. If I got a different answer from everybody, there's one thing that I could know for certain. You can't all be true at the same time. Your answers can. Maybe you got them all wrong. Maybe you're all wrong. Maybe only one of you got it correct. But one thing I can know, if I'm assuming there's an objective answer to that, well, objectivity doesn't mean that, well, yeah, everybody's answer is right. No, objective means it's independent of everybody's belief or answer. So your answer will line up with hopefully the objective fact. So in philosophy, because we have different answers to, they can't, and that's what makes it difficult. We can't know, well, I mean, one thing that we know for certain is they can't all be right. Maybe everybody's wrong on a particular philosophical question and answer. But if everybody's given a different answer, they can't all be correct. If one's saying there is a human soul and the other one's saying there isn't, can they both be correct? No, so then you can, here's what's difficult about philosophy, but also what's extremely rewarding. If you want to know a particular fact in any one of these, particularly like mathematics or the empirical sciences, what do? You just open up the book. It tells you. In fact, you really don't have to do much work at all. You trust that that science, or that particular science, has established that as fact. So I guarantee you, how many people, I mean, we all believe that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. How many people know how to do Euclid's proof, book 1, proposition 47, to prove that that's actually true? We just assume it, right? We hope that, I hope the mathematicians figured that out. But I guarantee you, most of us probably haven't actually done that proof. So we don't actually know. We're assuming that we, by just what? Looking at the book. The difficult problem with philosophy and the nature of it is you can't trust anybody. Why? Because they're all giving different answers. Now, does that mean we need to throw up our hands and say, well, that's because it's all opinion and there is no objective answer? No, we saw that's not the case. In fact, what I encourage you is to approach this as if you were a detective, a philosophical detective. What does a detective do? A detective holds everybody in suspicion. Oh, I can't believe anybody. Now, does the detective just throw up their hands and say, well, that's because there's really no objective answer who killed the mailman? Because I can't trust anybody. No, a detective must find the objective answer. People's lives depend on it. While holding everybody in suspicion, questioning, but using it as evidence. That's what you have to do. And notice, that's a very individualistic exercise. That it has to be you who cannot trust your professor, what you're reading, or anything, but at the same time all using that as evidence, in which you can't just look up the answer, you've got to do the hard work, you have to figure it out, you have to go through and make a case and study, and then when you get the answer, you got it. Nobody gave it to you. A book didn't give it to you. You did the hard work, and it's individually rewarding. And there's more certitude in that. When you go through the work, if you did the proof for that, then you could stand up boldly and say, I know this. What are you talking about? I didn't just assume this. I did the hard work, and I proved it. And so philosophy, it takes more hard work. And this is why you're getting different answers. The difficulty level. You can't just look it up and get the answer. You've got to do it. And because it's concerned with all these different things, human values, also perspectives, the mind, it makes things a lot more complicated. There's a lot more things to think through and areas that you can make mistakes than should I accept 1 + 1 = 2? How many different disciplines and human values do I have to think through to get that answer? I don't. It's straightforward. Sound good? Okay, let's move into the pre-Socratics. I'm going to upload a document. The pre-Socratics are the very first philosophers, and actually it's the 6th century BC, which philosophy and science begins. Now, we don't have any of their original works. They were lost in part when the Library of Alexandria in Egypt was burned down. We lost these texts. We're indebted to the Islamic community because we had Islamic commentators that had taken those texts and were doing a lot of the commentaries and translations on Aristotle, mathematicians. And so we have some fragments of the pre-Socratics. Why? Because Aristotle and other authors were citing them. And because when the Library of Alexandria was burnt down, because the Islamic commentators and translators, they were able to preserve the text of Aristotle, we were kind of able to reformulate, i.e. in fragments, quotes from other ancient authors, and assemble these. So they're going to read very strangely, the fragments. They're going to read almost kind of like strange Portuguese. Also, you have this phenomenon of what we call the emergence out of the myth. You have mythology was the dominant culture of trying to explain things, and you have something new happening. Emerging out of mythology and the creation of a new method of thinking about truth called philosophy and science. And so part of their language is still going to invoke mythological kind of metaphorical. That's going to make it somewhat strange. So I'm going to assign what we call the Milesian philosophers. Read Thales, Anaximenes, and Anaximander. They're called the Milesians because they all lived in the port town of Miletus in Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. And so we grouped them. They were all, Thales is the very first philosopher, and then you have the pupils of them. And then write notes on that. And I will see you Thursday. All right, guys, take care. Thank you. Did anybody else need an ad code?